If I don't speak now, they'll keep burning the land we live on. And lie about it. That wasn't the voice of a scientist, not a CEO, not even a politician behind a polished podium. It was the trembling, steady voice of Imani Carter, an 11-year-old black girl from a small Texas town that once lit up with oil rigs and now burned because of them. She hadn't planned to become the center of America's attention that day. She was simply accompanying her mother to the headquarters of Rexton Corporation, a massive energy conglomerate on the brink of collapse. A gas leak had caused an explosion at one of their rigs, injuring dozens and threatening the entire future of Midway. Just minutes before the crucial meeting with an international climate delegation, the professional interpreter collapsed from an allergic reaction. And Imani stepped forward. No one asked her to. No one believed she could. But sometimes less underestimated voice is the one that echoes the loudest. With a voice still soft from childhood but words sharpened by truth, Imani didn't just translate languages that day, she translated lies into facts. She uncovered suppressed data, falsified environmental reports, and workers' silence through threats. She didn't just save a negotiation, she sparked a movement. A question began to ripple through boardrooms and newsrooms across the country: who gets to speak? And why are the honest voices always the ones buried? In today's video, you're not just going to witness an 11-year-old girl stand up to a billion-dollar system. You're going to uncover the truth hidden behind corporate gloss, spin, and silence. And you'll understand this. When a child has to speak because the grown-ups choose silence, it's no longer a story about age. It's a wake-up call. And if you've ever thought, I'm too small to change anything, let Imani Carter change your mind. Midway, Texas. The name sounds like something pulled straight from a history book. Weathered, quiet, nestled somewhere between scorched fields and sun-cracked asphalt. But to Imani Carter, it was home. The town didn't have a big grocery store, no movie theater, and sometimes the cell signal was so weak you had to stand in the backyard just to send a text. But it had the smell of burnt grass at dusk, the distant bark of dogs echoing past old wooden fences. And it had her mother, once a courtroom interpreter for immigration cases, now a motel housekeeper off the interstate. Imani's father had worked on the oil rigs for Rexton Corporation, the biggest energy company in the region. He believed in honest labor. Believed that if you just did your job, kept your head down, didn't stir trouble, things would work out. Until the day the rig exploded. He survived. But his right hand didn't. Since then, dinner at the Carter house was often quiet. Not because they didn't love each other, but because there were things adults didn't know how to say. And things they thought kids weren't supposed to hear. They were wrong. Imani wasn't like the other kids in class. She didn't talk much. She listened, closely. She took notes. The things her mother mumbled while cooking. The phrases her father let slip when he thought she was buried in homework. And when the house went silent, and the grown-ups were asleep, she stayed up, reading. Translating documents about energy law, methane emissions, corporate liability. No one taught her to do that. But she learned. Because she had questions. Because no one would answer when she asked. Why does the soil smell like rotten eggs after it rains? Why does Mr. Alvarez cough all night? Why is the tap water orange in the mornings? She needed answers. And no one had them. Until one morning when Midway woke up to sirens wailing and thick black smoke rising from the west. From Rig No. 7, 3 injured, 1 missing. And Rexton's press release called it a minor technical incident, with no impact on the community. But Imani knew better. Her father had flagged abnormal pressure readings 2 weeks before, and the very next day, he was let go. She remembered everything, the file names, the dates. The printed emails crumpled in the trash, the notes scribbled and tossed aside when her father was too exhausted to shred them. She didn't know what she'd do with those files. Not yet. Not until that fateful day, when the interpreter collapsed just before the International Climate Summit at Rexton headquarters, and all eyes turned toward the chaos. There she stood, 11 years old, wearing a faded gray hoodie, quiet, unnoticed, at the edge of the hallway. No one knew that tucked inside her backpack, beneath her math notebooks, was a copy of the very documents they had tried to bury. And no one expected that this child would be the first to say aloud what everyone knew, but no one dared admit. They knew, and they did nothing. 3 days after the explosion, the air in Midway still reeked of burnt chemicals, clinging to skin, to clothes, to the sun, faded rooftops of every home. People wore surgical masks to the grocery store. Some hung wet towels over their windows, hoping to filter out whatever invisible gas was now dancing on the wind. Rexton Corporation, once hailed as the economic heart of the region, had become a name spoken with narrowed eyes. And in many homes, with a string of curse words. The high-level methane leak at Rig No. 7 had sparked a massive blaze, scorching over 1,000 acres of scrubland. 3 workers were critically injured. 1 remained missing, Rudy Vasquez, A father of two, who had picked up the extra night shift because they were short-staffed. Within 6 hours, Rexton released a press statement. No verified environmental threat at this time. Meanwhile, the phones of environmental reporters, attorneys, and local officials lit up like a wildfire of their own. A delegation from the Inter-American Coalition was dispatched immediately to Texas. They weren't coming to shake hands. They were coming to negotiate liability. And, according to sources, possibly recommend a full shutdown of Rexton's operations if a deal couldn't be reached. The meeting was scheduled for Monday, 9 a.m. at Rexton's main headquarters. A sterile glass building on the southern edge of town, where most locals had never been allowed past the lobby. Imani wasn't on the guest list. But she knew that day mattered. Her mother, Celeste, had been assigned to clean the 8th floor, where the conference room was located. She woke Imani up early and told her to stay home, study. But Imani had grown used to those kinds of instructions. She quietly tucked a few documents into her backpack, slid earbuds into her jacket pocket, and rode the first bus of the day with her mother toward Rexton HQ. By 8:50 a.m., the 8th floor conference room was packed. Rexton executives, all in matching gray suits, stood in tight circles muttering phrases like risk containment, PR backlash, and legal exposure. On the other side sat 5 members of the International Climate Delegation. A Brazilian, a Honduran, a Canadian, and 2 independent representatives from climate research institutions. They spoke English fluently, but during quiet exchanges, they slipped into Portuguese and Spanish. At the head of the table sat a red-haired woman in her 40s with large glasses. The lead interpreter flown in from Washington. She had worked with the UN, known for her calm and control. 9:03 a.m., no one had taken a sip of water. Not a single word of negotiation had begun. And then, the interpreter staggered. One hand gripped the table. The other clutched at her throat. She began coughing, sharp, gasping, uncontrollable. Her lips turned pale. Her eyes rolled. Within 10 seconds, she collapsed to the floor like a tree suddenly felled. Someone screamed. A Rexton executive called for security. The medical officer rushed in. Another voice shouted. "It's an allergic reaction. I think she's going into shock." And just outside the open doorway, Imani stood frozen in the hallway. One hand gripping the strap of her backpack. Her eyes locked on the chaos inside. A crisis had just begun. No one noticed her. No one knew she had just translated almost the entire pre-meeting conversation in both languages. Silently, fluently, word for word. And no one could have guessed that in less than 10 minutes, she would be the only person in that room capable of saving it from collapse. Imani couldn't quite remember why she stepped into the room. Maybe it was the scream. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was because she had been walking toward that moment for weeks. Without even knowing it. What happened next moved fast. The interpreter had already been wheeled out on a stretcher, a white cloth draped across her face. A paramedic followed close behind, holding an empty epinephrine syringe. No one said out loud how she was doing, but the looks on the adults' faces said enough. A Brazilian delegate frowned, muttered something in Portuguese to his colleague. A Rexton executive stared down at his phone. And in the corner, Doug Langston, CEO of Rexton, tall, silver-haired, with eyes cold as steel, slammed a hand against the table. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. He said, voice low but strung tight. "We don't have an interpreter. If they walk away over a technicality, our stock drops 12 points by this afternoon." A young assistant spoke up, voice shaking. "I could try a translation app." Doug looked up, scoffed. "So we let AI mistranslate a liability clause and cost us $200 million. No." He slapped the table again, louder. "We need a person, not a machine." And just then, at the edge of the doorway, Imani stood frozen. In her backpack were the documents her father once buried. In her mind were nights of overhearing her mother read through environmental audits. And in her chest, a pounding so fierce she felt like she might throw up. She stepped forward. "I can help," she said. Her voice was clear, not loud, but it cracked through the tension like a lightning bolt. Every head turned. A little girl, barely chest height to the adults, wearing a worn gray hoodie, slightly scuffed sneakers, and a backpack that had seen better days. Sun-kissed face, bright black eyes, hands clenched tightly at her sides. Some furrowed their brows. Others chuckled. Doug Langston didn't laugh. He slowly rose from his chair, eyeing her like she was a scratch on his Bentley. "And who are you?" he asked, voice soaked in skepticism. "Imani Carter," she replied. "I speak both Portuguese and Spanish. I can interpret." A white woman in a black pantsuit whispered. "She's probably the cleaning lady's kid." A man nearby muttered. "This is ridiculous." Doug's jaw tightened. "Get her out of here before this becomes a sideshow." 2 security guards moved forward. Imani took a step back, but didn't retreat. "Please," she said louder this time. "I understand what's going on. I know both languages. I even know the terminology they're using. If you don't let me try." This company will collapse. A beat of silence. Then one executive, thin, glasses, probably newer than the rest, whispered, "What did she just say?" "She said we're going to collapse," replied the woman beside him, still unconvinced. Doug clenched his jaw. This is madness. The guards touched Imani's arms. She flinched and pulled away. "Just give me a chance," she said again. Her voice trembled, but didn't break. "I don't need you to believe in me. I just need you to let me try." Doug looked at her like a riddle he didn't have time to solve. Then finally, he muttered, "We're out of time. If she's wrong, there won't be anything left to lose." He nodded once. The guards let go. Imani took a deep breath. And for the first time, the room went silent. Not out of fear, but because no one knew what was about to happen next. Imani stepped toward the head of the table, slowly, like she was crossing a narrow bridge suspended above a canyon. She didn't carry a briefcase, no iPad, no name tag, not even a blazer, just a worn-out gray hoodie and a backpack that had seen too many school days. But each step echoed through the room like a knock on a locked door adults had tried to keep shut for years. The international delegates stared at her, puzzled. Some whispered to one another. The woman from Honduras tilted her head and softly asked in Spanish, "¿Quién es la niña? Who is this child?" Imani caught every word. She turned toward her and answered, in perfect, steady Spanish, "Mi nombre es Imani Carter. Estoy aquí para ayudar." "My name is Imani Carter. I'm here to help interpret." The woman raised her eyebrows. Across the table, the Brazilian delegate let out a quiet laugh and whispered in Portuguese, "Ela es uma criança." She's just a kid. Imani didn't turn her head. But she heard him, and she responded, in fluent Portuguese palm firm, "Posso ser uma criança, mas também sou fluente. E agora sua técnica ponte entre vox e o acordo." I may be a child, but I'm fluent. And right now, I'm the only bridge between you and this agreement. The room paused. For the first time, the Brazilian looked at her not as a disruption, but as someone worth listening to. At the far end, Doug Langston leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He didn't speak. His eyes stayed locked on her, as if watching a magic trick. Waiting to be proven it was impossible. A legal assistant handed Imani a briefing packet. 17 pages, printed in tight, dense font. She took it with both hands, laid it on the table, and didn't immediately look down. She looked around the room. Every face was a live broadcast in her mind. They didn't believe in her. They were waiting for her to trip. She felt it, like quicksand inching up her ankles. Then a voice broke the silence. Renato da Costa, head of the PAN, American Climate Committee, began to speak, in rich, rounded Portuguese. Formal tone, laced with just a trace of sarcasm when mentioning the conveniently timed absence of a certified interpreter. Imani translated as he spoke, in crisp, fluent English, but she didn't just interpret words, she translated feeling. When Mr. Da Costa described the methane stench clinging to Texans' hair, like an invisible curse, Imani echoed the metaphor with a subtle inflection that made every American in the room shift in their seats. The room, once braced for disaster, began to lean forward. A legal advisor whispered, "She's translating better than last year's interpreter." Another tilted his head. "She doesn't just know the language. She knows what it means." Doug Langston remained silent. Imani kept going. The meeting shifted into its most critical phase, liability terms. When the PAN, American delegation proposed a clause invoking liability exemption under cross-border ecological impact. A mouthful of legal nuance. Imani paused for less than a second, then calmly delivered, "Conditional exemption from liability, in cases where environmental consequences extend beyond projected scope and cross national borders." Chairs shifted, backs straightened. And in that moment, for the very first time, no one in the room asked who she was anymore. They simply listened. Everything was going so smoothly. No one noticed the tension still lurking under the table. Imani continued translating, effortlessly moving between two worlds. On one side, men in tailored Armani suits, their eyes sharp, calculating. On the other, environmental delegates carrying the last hopes of thousands living in the toxic shadow of methane clouds. She missed nothing. Not a word, not a beat. But then it happened. One word. Juspensa. Mr. Renato had just spoken it, and the room fell into silence, waiting for Imani to translate. Her heart skipped. She knew the word, she'd studied it, seen it in countless legal documents. But here, now in this context, it suddenly split in three. Dispensação could mean a special exemption, or a regulatory waiver, or, worst of all, a legal loophole for liability escape. It was the kind of intentional ambiguity adults used in contracts, where one mistranslation could cost millions, or lives. Imani looked up. The room hadn't noticed her pause, but Doug Langston had. He narrowed his eyes, still reclined in his leather chair. His expression gave nothing away, but in that steel, gray gaze, Imani saw it clearly. He knew. He knew that word was a trap. And he was waiting to see if she'd fall into it. She swallowed hard. Her eyes darted across the table. A few people were beginning to glance at one another. Whispers crept in. She's stuck. She's not sure. One heartbeat. Then another. Then Imani lifted her head, calm and steady. She looked Mr. Renato straight in the eyes, not with fear but with precision. And she asked in crisp Portuguese, Desculpe, senhor. Quando menciona dispensabao, referia se isenscao regulat ria o liberdade de exportação. Excuse me, sir. When you said dispensasmao, did you mean regulatory exemption or export clearance? A beat of silence. Then Renato smiled. He nodded gently. Isensao regulat ria. Regulatory exemption. Imani nodded in return, then turned to the Rexton side. He confirms it's a legal exemption within the bounds of regulatory oversight. Not related to product transport or shipping. A breath escaped the entire room. Like a balloon had been secretly deflating and now found release. A legal advisor leaned toward his colleague and whispered. She just saved this deal from a 10-year lawsuit. Doug said nothing. But he wasn't leaning back anymore. And at that very moment, something shifted. No longer was Imani, the kid who spoke a few languages. No longer the backup when the real interpreter collapsed. She was the fulcrum. The only one in that room who had asked the right question at the exact moment no one else dared to speak. And from that moment on, every word she spoke was heard. Not because of her age, not because of her degrees, not because of her title, but because when truth teetered on the edge of being twisted by just one word, she was the only one brave enough to pause and ask. No one was laughing anymore. No one was scoffing. In fact, no one even remembered that the girl standing in the middle of the conference room was just 11 years old. After the moment that nearly shattered the negotiation, Imani continued translating with astonishing composure. Her voice wasn't loud, but every time she spoke, the room paused. She became more than a translator. She was the live wire connecting two languages, two mindsets, and, more deeply, two worlds built on mutual suspicion. Then it was Rexton's turn to speak. One of their financial advisors, Mr. Carson, began raising concerns about exchange rate volatility. He warned that converting between Breverton Ries and US dollars over an extended payment period could create significant financial fluctuations. Technically, he wasn't wrong. Politically, it was a subtle way of stalling the deal. Imani translated, smoothly, neutrally, but she was watching. Specifically, she was watching Mr. Renato. Though he sat upright, nodding politely, his eyes lowered slightly. His lips pressed into a tight line. Beside him, Miss Lucia shot him a brief glance, like she wanted to speak. But no one interrupted Imani. When she finished, Lucia's eyes flicked toward Imani. Just for a second. But it was enough. They weren't just worried about the currency. They were running out of time. Imani recalled what Renato had said earlier. This deal must close within 48 hours. But why? Why the urgency? Then it clicked. The delegation was under pressure, too. Their governments were watching. Their climate budgets were on the chopping block. They needed a tangible win. Fast, to prove international environmental cooperation wasn't a waste of time. Imani could have stayed quiet. Played it safe. Just done her job. Disappointed no one. But she didn't. She turned to Sophia Ray, Rexton's strategy director. The only executive in the room who had silently tracked Imani's every move from the beginning. Imani whispered. They're not worried about currency. They're worried about time. Sophia raised an eyebrow. You sure? Imani nodded. If we offer a delayed payment clause but guarantee currency stability, they'll say yes. They just need this to go through, fast. Sophia glanced toward Doug, then murmured, say it. Imani straightened, turned to Mr. Renato, and spoke in confident Portuguese. Mr. Renato, Rexton would like to propose a stabilization clause. Payments can be made in 2 phases, with the second phase protected under a fixed exchange rate for 60 days. Renato looked up, surprised, then nodded slightly. He turned to his delegation. They spoke in hushed tones. Imani didn't interrupt. She didn't translate. She knew, in that moment, silence said more than words. Finally, Renato looked back at her. If Rexton agrees to the 60-day lock, then we agree. A Rexton legal advisor nearly dropped his pen. Sophia exhaled. And Doug, for the first time that entire meeting, allowed himself a smile. A small one, not of joy, but of respect. Imani continued her work, but she knew the line had vanished. She was no longer a stand-in interpreter. She had just saved the deal. And everyone in the room knew it. Imani didn't remember how many lines she translated after that. Once her mind crossed the threshold of fear, all that remained was rhythm. A back and forth cadence, words, tone, glances, logic, and then the next sentence. She moved through that space between worldly, without fanfare, without dramatics, but with absolute precision. In less than 40 minutes, the final terms were sealed. There were no slammed fists, no shouting matches, just the sound of paper being flipped, pens signing in rapid strokes, And the kind of tense silence only veteran negotiators truly understand. When Mr. Renato signed the last page, he said nothing. He simply looked across the table at Imani and gave a quiet nod. She nodded back. And then, as if someone had finally pulled the pin from a pressure valve, the entire room released. A rush of exhaled breaths, hands clapping shoulders, a few genuine smiles. Someone clapped. Then another, and suddenly, the whole room was on its feet, erupting in applause. Not the polite, obligatory kind, but the applause of people who knew. If it weren't for that girl, this meeting would have collapsed in the very first minute. Imani stood still. Back straight. Her small hands still gripping the summary contract. Its corners now wrinkled with sweat. She didn't know whether to smile or bow, so she simply stood there, like an invisible pillar between two tides of change. Then came hurried footsteps. A door swung open at the end of the hallway, and a voice rang out through the room's celebration. Imani. She turned. It was her mother. Celeste Carter. White button, down shirt, blue work pants, smudged with dust from cleaning supplies. Her natural curls were a little frizzed from rushing. But her face carried a light no diamond could ever imitate. The fierce, radiant pride of a mother. Celeste stopped just inside the room. Her eyes shimmered. Then she crossed the floor and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Imani exhaled, a soft breath, like she'd been holding it for 2 full hours. She leaned into her mother's shoulder. I did it, she whispered. I know, Celeste said, hugging her tighter. I always knew. The room quieted again, but this time it was the silence of witness. Executives, scientists, staff, assistants, people used to numbers and power, stood still, watching something they'd never seen before. Doug Langston stepped forward, stopping just in front of Imani and her mother. He removed his thin, rimmed glasses, slid them into his jacket pocket, and said gently, Ms. Carter, today, your daughter saved 200 jobs. She saved a town. And she saved the company I've spent 30 years building. That's not just talent, that's leadership. Celeste opened her mouth to reply, but Imani spoke first. My mom taught me how to listen. And my dad taught me to be brave when truth stands alone. Doug nodded. He didn't say anything more. But he turned to his assistant and ordered, schedule a press conference. And someone, get this young lady a glass of orange juice. Laughter broke out. Light, relieved. The last tension in the room vanished like smoke after a fire. Imani sat on the edge of a chair, her feet still dangling above the floor. Her hoodie was soaked with sweat. Her hands clutched the cold glass. But there was no more hesitation in her eyes. Only light. The kind that appears when someone has just done what no one believed was possible. 3 days after that fateful meeting, Imani Carter was no longer a name lost in the crowd. She appeared on the evening news of all 3 major U.S. networks. A few headlines dubbed her, the girl who spoke truth in 2 languages. The hashtag #FenImanith interpreter swept across Twitter, TikTok and Reddit. Clips of her standing at the negotiation table, a small warrior among suits and boardroom veterans, went viral. One comment read, she's 11. And she had more courage than an entire board of directors. But with every spotlight, comes a shadow. And this shadow crept in from the most familiar place. Those who didn't want the truth dragged too far into the light. On Wednesday morning, Celeste opened the front door to collect the newspaper like always. And froze. The front page of a tabloid screamed in bold red letters, genius girl or PR stunt. Is Rexton using a minor to save face? Imani saw the headline when her mother laid the paper on the kitchen table. She didn't say a word. But that morning, she didn't finish her second bite of breakfast. On TV, a conservative pundit scoffed with theatrical disbelief. An 11-year-old interpreting international legal contracts. Do they think we're stupid? This was clearly a stage performance by Rexton's PR team. Another sneered. If she's that smart, why not make her Secretary of State? Words like that, sharp, snide, and repeated, cut deeper than most adults realize. Imani tried to ignore it. She still went to school. Still studied. Still read her books. But she could feel it in the hallway stairs. In the way some classmates looked at her differently now. Not everyone believed her. Worse, not everyone wanted her to succeed. One afternoon, she overheard 2 girls whispering just a little too loudly behind her backs. Her mom probably coached her. Adults are sneaky like that. I heard her dad used to work for Rexton. It's probably all connected. That evening, when she got home, she found her mom standing outside in the yard, gripping her phone tightly. Celeste's eyes were red. They're calling you a pawn, she said, voice low and shaking with fury. They're saying I used you. That I put you up to this for attention. They're even digging into your father's records. Imani didn't speak right away. The wind moved softly through the quiet Midway neighborhood. A car rolled by, scattering dry leaves like confetti after a too short celebration. Then she said, her voice lower than usual, steady, Mom, I didn't do it for Rexton. I did it for what Dad believed, and what you taught me. She looked up. Not with innocence, but clarity. If they're scared of a kid who speaks 2 languages and knows how to ask the right question. That's their problem. Not mine. Celeste looked at her daughter. And in those small, dark eyes, she didn't just see brilliance, she saw awakening. The kind of awareness that understands justice doesn't always win. That truth doesn't always get applause. But that doesn't mean you stay quiet. Ever. 3 weeks after the historic negotiation, Imani Carter sat before the House Committee on Environmental Oversight and National Resources. The 11-year-old girl, dressed in a simple blue dress, hair braided into 2 neat rows, plain black shoes, sat at the long table draped in white linen, facing 13 members of Congress and nearly 40 cameras aimed directly at her. At first, Imani hadn't planned to say much. She'd been invited as a media witness, just to recount her experience at the Rexton negotiation, part of a promotional push for the newly introduced Youth Civic Language Rights Act. It was meant to be a showpiece, a feel-good soundbite. But when the committee clerk handed Imani a pre-written statement to read, she knew something was off. She flipped through the pages, then looked up and gently asked, "Who wrote this, ma'am?" The clerk smiled politely. "We adjusted it slightly for congressional tone. Nothing you need to worry about." Imani nodded, but the calm in her eyes was gone. On page 3, where she clearly remembered noting a vague clause that could lead to legal immunity for Rexton, the language had been scrubbed. In its place, all terms were fully and mutually agreed upon by both parties. That was a lie. She glanced toward the gallery, where her mother sat quietly. Celeste's eyes asked a silent question. "You okay, baby?" Imani took a breath, and when it was her turn to speak, she stood, not reading from the paper, but placing it to the side. The room fell silent. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Members of Congress. I didn't come here today to be applauded. I came here to tell the truth. Not the comfortable version, but the honest one. Some members straightened in their seats. During the meeting between Rexton and the Pan-American delegation, there was one clause, one single word, that nearly caused the deal to collapse. Because it was vague, because someone wanted it to stay vague. I paused. I asked. I clarified. That decision saved a deal. And it saved a town. But today, in the document this committee handed me, that part has been erased. And I will not sit here and be silent about that. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. A congresswoman covered her mouth. A legal aide leaned into his colleague. One of the cameras zoomed in on Imani's face. No fear, only an unshakable calm. If grown-ups are afraid of a child telling the truth, that's not the child's fault. That's a problem with this system. I don't represent any party. I'm just a young citizen who loves the truth, and I refuse to be anyone's puppet. If that means I'll be criticized, questioned, or pushed aside today, so be it. But at least, I still have my voice, and I will use it. She ended without waiting for applause. But it came anyway, starting from a few seats in the back, then spreading through the entire chamber. And in the eyes of some legislators there was shame. But there was also awakening. Because in a room full of power, only one child had the courage to call the truth by its real name. That day, the U.S. Capitol held its breath. Behind the thick wooden doors of Hearing Room 3, under the House Committee on Energy and Environment, dozens of cameras had been set up since early morning. Congressmen adjusted their ties, whispered to aides, while the sound technician wiped sweat from his brow. On social media, a hashtag had climbed into the national top 30 then Imani Speaks, and among all the powerful names, the one invited to speak that morning wasn't a CEO, wasn't a climate scientist, wasn't a former senator. It was an 11-year-old girl, wearing a plain white dress, her hair braided neatly, and black shoes worn at the toes. Stepping up to the podium with a voice that did not tremble, when the microphone lit green and the chairperson's voice echoed, "Ms. Carter, the floor is yours." The entire room fell still. Then Imani spoke, softly, but with each word carrying the weight of belief. "I'm not a scientist. I'm not a CEO. But I live where the smoke lands. I live in a town where the air makes your chest hurt when you wake up. Where kids bring inhalers to recess like they bring lunch boxes. Where the water smells like rust. And people pretend it's fine, because pretending is cheaper than fixing. I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm not even old enough to vote, but I am old enough to know that when you lie with numbers, people die quietly." Several older congressmen looked up. One took off his glasses, wiped the lenses. A younger congresswoman gave the slightest nod. Imani paused, letting her eyes sweep across the lenses broadcasting live to millions across America. When I translated during that meeting between Rexton and the Latin American delegation, I wasn't just switching words. I was translating fear, pressure, desperation. I was the bridge between people who needed to be heard and people who needed to stop pretending they were listening. And when I came home, they called me a tool, said I was being used, But the only ones doing the using are the ones still polluting, still hiding behind legal language, still paying for silence. The tension in the room shifted, like a tide just before it breaks. At the far end, a Rexton staffer lowered his head, and then, as if perfectly timed, a breaking statement from the new CEO of Clearwater Petro, another major energy firm, hit the news wires and screens during Imani's testimony. It was short, but it was thunder. We've heard the girl. And for the first time, we're really listening. On behalf of Clearwater, we apologize for the harm caused, and we commit to opening all emission records for independent review. Starting today. The room froze. A little girl had just cracked open a system, using the one thing grown-ups had long underestimated the truth. Imani bowed her head to end her testimony. But her final sentence, the one not in her prepared statement, was what made the entire chamber rise to their feet. If you don't want kids speaking truth in your hearing rooms, then maybe the grown-ups should start doing it first. Not everyone comes back from Capitol Hill with a medal. Imani Carter didn't. She didn't get a medal, no book deal, no glamorous talk show circuit or nationwide inspiration tour. She returned to Midway, Texas, where the smoke still lingered in the air, and the smokestacks still refused to sleep. But she came back with something different. At age 12, she didn't want to be anyone's child icon or media miracle. She wanted to do something real, for kids like her. Kids who were never heard. Never taught to ask questions, always told to stay quiet. So she started something, the Truth Tellers Fund. The goal wasn't to save the planet in a day, it was to plant seeds, in the forgotten corners, in towns where children live next door to chemical plants, where playgrounds sit beside runoff barrels, where the loudest lesson grown-ups teach is, don't get involved. Imani didn't show up in these places with lectures. She came with stories. Stories about the right to understand, the right to question, and most importantly, the right to speak. Through her foundation, she created programs for critical thinking, media literacy, rhetorical training, and language awareness. Skills once reserved for law school, now taught to 9- and 10-year-olds. In one session in Baton Rouge, a boy raised his hand after class and asked, "Miss Imani, what if we speak and no one listens?" She smiled, crouched to his level, and replied, "Then you keep speaking. Words don't die, they just hide in someone's heart, waiting to grow louder." In every community she visited, she planted a tree, a young oak, a scrub pine, a eucalyptus sapling, the kind that once grew near her family's old oil rig. Not to build a forest in a week, but to plant patience. The one thing truth always needs to survive the firestorm of doubt. Epilogue for TTS. Today, if you walk past Midway Elementary, you'll find a small plaque in the grass. It reads, "Here stood a girl who didn't whisper when the world was burning." And when asked what her biggest lesson was, from everything she's seen, everything she's fought, Imani Carter, now 17, founder of a nonprofit for empowerment, simply says, "They set fire to the ground beneath us. But I learned, when they burn, we speak. Fire can't kill a voice, and one honest voice can plant a forest in the flames."